Now let's look at the 15 elements of Dublin Core in a little more depth. These are the 15 elements of Dublin Core: contributor, coverage, creator, date, description, format, identifier, language, publisher, relation, rights, source, subject, title, and type, right? That's in alphabetical order. Remember what I said in the previous video is that when you're creating a Dublin Core metadata record, you can include these in any order, right? I just included them alphabetically here, but that's an arbitrary order. So let's look at those in more depth right now. This is the page on the Dublin Core's website that describes all of the 15 elements in a little bit of detail. First, you've got some introduction and et cetera, et cetera. So again, it lists them in alphabetical order, but I'm not going to do these alphabetically. I'm going to do these in what I think is a more logical order. So let's scroll down to title. Title. Definition: a name given to the resource. Comment: typically a title will be a name by which the resource is formally known. That sounds like title to me, right? Title of a book, title of a movie, title of a painting, whatever. It's not saying that it's the only title. I'm going to use the example of the Mona Lisa later in this unit. Now, the Mona Lisa has several titles, has had over the centuries, and has different names in different languages. Title is not saying it is the one and only canonical title. It's just saying a title. Creator: an entity primarily responsible for making the resource. Includes a person, an organization, or a service. Again, every element is repeatable. You can have more than one creator for a single resource. Subject: the topic of the resource. So you've got title, creator, and subject. Those are, at least in library land, sort of the big three. Those are the totally traditional, very typical descriptors of any kind of information resource that you're used to seeing in at least libraries. Title, creator, or author in library land often, subject, right? Those are absolutely the most common kinds of descriptors. So obviously you've got those three. But then, not only do you have creator, but you have contributor. An entity responsible for making contributions to the resource. The distinction here is between primary creator and secondary creator. If we're talking about, again, a film, the filmmaker or the author of the screenplay might be listed as the creator. The actors or the crew might be listed as contributors. Other people who contributed to the creation but are not the primary. And then, on top of that, you get publisher, an entity responsible for making the resource available. A person, an organization, a service, what have you, right? If you're thinking about books or films, the publisher would be the publishing house for a book. For a film, it would be the movie studio, right? The organization often, or I should say an organization, is often the publisher. Sometimes you have individuals, but more often it's likely to be a collective entity like a company or some kind of organization like that. So you've got three flavors of creator. You've got the primary creator, the creator, the secondary creator, a contributor, and a publisher, which is some entity responsible for making the thing available. 3 different flavors of creator. Date. A point or period of time associated with an event in the life cycle of the resource. You can have lots of different dates. You can have date of creation. You can have date of modification. You can have date of deletion, right? Any number of things can have dates associated with them if you're talking about a resource that exists over some span of time. Now, here's the question. How do you define a point or period of time? That can be at any level of granularity, right? So, for example, you could say, this book was published in 2013. Or you could say that the Mona Lisa was created between 1503 and 1506. Or you could say that this lacquer box was created in Edo-era Japan. Any level of granularity. Date does not have to be a particular day and time. It can be a time span, like Edo-era Japan. But notice that recommended best practice is to use an encoding scheme such as this particular profile, which is a fairly standard, I'll show it to you, fairly standard date and time format, which is adopted by the W3C. These are the standard formats, different ways of displaying year, month, day, time, right? So recommended practice for Dublin Core is to use that format, right? Date says recommended best practice. It doesn't say required practice. And again, this gets to the simplicity of applying Dublin Core. Dublin Core doesn't require much of anything. So recommended best practice, but not required practice. Scroll down a bit to language. Fairly self-explanatory. Again, recommended best practice is to use a controlled vocabulary, such as RFC 4646. So again, RFC 4646 is a standard recommendation for how to represent languages online. So if we look at the table of contents here, there's a very long set of instructions for how to do this. Let's look at Appendix B. So let me search for Appendix B. And I'm sure you have seen this kind of thing before, these 2-letter codes for languages. The various language versions of Wikipedia, for example, use those 2-letter codes. Right? So again, Dublin Core says recommended best practice is to use a controlled vocabulary such as, right? Again, not required, but recommended. Subject, right? Revisiting subject here, recommended best practice is to use a controlled vocabulary. They don't say which controlled vocabulary. Why not? Because there are lots of controlled vocabularies out there, right? Take your pick. But they recommend that you choose your favorite controlled vocabulary for describing subject and use that. Description is the next one I want to look at. An account of the resource. Well, that's a little vague. May include, but is not limited to, an abstract, a table of contents, a graphical representation, some kind of brief description. If we're talking about books, it's often the blurb, right, on the flyleaf. If we're talking about, published papers, an abstract, any kind of brief description. Coverage is interesting. Spatial or temporal topic of the resource, the jurisdiction under which it's relevant. Basically, what we're talking about here is geographic coverage. Recommended best practice is to use a controlled vocabulary such as the thesaurus of geographic names, which we'll look at later. Then we have format, the file format, physical medium, or dimensions, right? Recommended best practice is to use a controlled vocabulary such as MIME types, right? And let's look at MIME types. MIME types are descriptors of every kind of file that exists on the entire web. And the list of MIME types here is, a mile long, so I won't get into these. But every single file format that exists has a MIME type associated with it, and different applications use different MIME types. For example, you can't open a, video file in a word processor and vice versa. So format is file format or physical medium. Recommend use MIME types. As opposed to type, which is the nature or genre of the resource, whatever that means. Recommended best practice is to use a controlled vocabulary such as DCMI type vocabulary. Right? So the distinction here is between format and type. The DCMI, Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, type vocabulary is this. Is something a collection? Is it a data set? Is it an event, etc.? Right? It's not a file format. It's a different type of type. Identifier. Unambiguous reference to a resource within a given context. Identify the resource by means of a string conforming to a formal identification system. On the web, we're used to dealing with URLs, but URLs are tricky. The thing that's at a URL can change, so there's something that's called a URI, a Uniform Resource Identifier, and those are intended to be unique. I won't get into the distinction between URLs and URIs, but there are lots of different formal identification systems. Social security numbers, barcodes, all of these are attempts at, unique identifiers for resources. Then we have source and relation. Source is a related resource from which the described resource is derived. In other words, we have a resource and it has a parent-child relationship. For example, we might have the Mona Lisa, the original painting, and some digital representation of that, or an original version of a file and then later versions of the same file, right? Some kind of derivative relationship. So there's source and relation, which is simply a related resource. What is the relation between these two resources? A single file that has multiple versions, that can be a single resource, or it can be a set of resources, and what is the relationship between all those different versions? Then we have rights. Statement about various property rights, including intellectual property, copyright, patent, trademark, right? What kind of intellectual property rights are relevant to this particular resource? And that's the set. Those are all of the 15 elements of Dublin Core. The idea is that those 15 elements can be used to describe any resource on the entire internet, right? Any networked resource. But because these elements are so generic, they can actually be used to describe anything at all. At my institution at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, we have an herbarium, and they collect botanical samples. And you could use the Dublin core elements to describe those botanical samples, right? You can describe anything at all. So now let's move on to talk about creating metadata records using these 15 elements.